All right, we're back. Let's talk a little bit about exercise in adulthood. Inactivity is associated with every chronic disease that we could possibly list. Like if you're inactive at 25, the probability of having some kind of chronic disease like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular problems or something like that by the time you're 50 is way higher than if you are physically active. Even small amounts of exercise can help. I mean, it feels like again, us Americans can be very, all or nothing. And so it feels like people think that if they can't go run a marathon, they might as well not do anything. And, just small amounts of exercise can help. Walking, you know, a little farther than is necessary, like park at the back, or, lifting weights while you watch TV or Netflix or whatever, like just little small amounts can really help to offset the effects. Sitting for long periods of time, we now are starting to consider, like worse than smoking. And most of us sit for long periods of time. I mean, it's sort of how our culture has been set up. So now we have these things where they advise us to, get up, move around, position your chair in such a way that you're actually, you know, allowing your blood to flow correctly and not pinching nerves and things like that. Like get up, stand up every 30 minutes. I've got this old antiquated picture from based on how she's dressed and how her hair looks. I'm going to say late 80s. And here we are chatting around the water cooler. Back in the old days, if you worked in an office, you couldn't send an email or a text or a Vox or a Slack message or any of those things to your peer across the floor where you work. You had to get up and go walk over and talk to them. Maybe you called them on the phone, but that annoyed people. When I worked in an office, it annoyed people if you were calling across because you'd hear the phones ringing. It's just so annoying. So people would get up, they'd walk over, and they'd say, "Hey, have you processed that file yet?" or whatever. And you would get steps in just inadvertently during the day all the time. Like you just had to walk around and do stuff. You didn't sit solidly for 8 hours at your desk. Today, you can literally sit down the entire time. And a lot of us working from home found that to be a huge problem during the pandemic, that we were not getting up. I found at the beginning of the pandemic, transitioning my face to face classes to online and things like that, that I was working till like 9 o'clock at night, and I was sitting still trying to get all this stuff made. It was awful. That first quarter was awful because I wasn't moving around and doing anything, and I got really super stiff and things were hurting, and it was awful. And really getting up every 30 minutes on purpose is a really good idea no matter what else is going on. Every 30 minutes, just get up, walk around, do a couple jumping jacks, just small things. All right, now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about something that all of us have to cope with in adulthood, and that's stress. I mean, life is full of things that will trigger our fight or flight response. We maybe encountered something that's actually scary, right? Like a near miss car accident, or somebody tried to steal our purse, or, I mean, like something that's actually scary, or it could be something that is like annoying, that makes us angry. We encounter those kinds of things all the time, and it activates our fight or flight response. And our fight or flight response is a part of our brain that gets our body ready to either fight with the target of our, fear or anger, or to flee from it. So it gets our heart beating faster. It causes our adrenal glands to secrete a bunch of adrenaline. Our stomach stops digesting the last meal that we ate. Our pupils dilate. Our bladder releases itself. Like a whole bunch of things happen when we're experiencing that fight or flight response. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how to cope with stress. Now, first off, this Selye introduced this idea of the general adaptation syndrome, and he argued that when a stressor occurs, our ability to resist it or to cope with it at first takes a little bit of a dip, right? During that phase one, the alarm reaction takes a little dip. And you may have had this experience where something startling, scary, or angering happens and you actually freeze for a second and you can't fight or flee. You're kind of frozen for a second. And then you're in phase two, you start to be able to marshal your defenses and actually resist. And you can resist by running or you can resist by fighting. But this phase two period can only last so long. Selye thought maybe 20 minutes before you start to reach exhaustion, right? You can only run so far before, you can't run anymore. There's only so much fighting you can do before you can't do it anymore. And so phase three is exhaustion. You've reached your max capacity. You can't cope anymore. So you were designed to have really like these 20-minute bursts of really intense stress, and then you need to be able to recover from it. We have a part of our brain that mobilizes us for the fight or the flight, and then we have a different part of our brain that sort of calms us back down and returns everything back to normal. But what happens in our regular life is that the stressful life events are not usually, a bear chasing us in the woods or, somebody who's trying to attack us and we have to fight him off or something. More commonly, we have everyday stressors. Catastrophic events, something like an earthquake or being in a war zone or the area got flooded or your house burned down or there was a terrorist attack. These kinds of catastrophic events are very stressful, but in a certain way are less harmful to us because they're very acute stressors. And they are the kind of thing that really marshals everybody to come together and help. After an earthquake, here comes the Red Cross. After a flood or a fire, here comes the Red Cross. And people have like a strategy for how to help you to cope through this catastrophic event. And that's kind of a benefit for us is that like a lot of times with catastrophic events, it's a region-wide thing. You're in a war zone or there was a terrorist attack. That's a region-wide thing and everybody's going through it and we're all kind of supporting each other and there are systems in place and like for some people their way of coping with stress is really like being the people who solve these problems. And so in a lot of ways catastrophic events are not really our problem as far as adult stress issues. Significant life changes might be one of our problems. The death of a loved one is a great example of something that's very stressful, right? Or getting divorced. They say, in fact, getting divorced is more stressful than the death of a loved one because of all the decisions you have to make. You don't decide for your loved one to die, but you have to decide to have your marriage die, right? Like, so it's really super stressful. Moving is really stressful. There's like all the logistics of it and then being in a new place and all the things that go along with moving. But other things that you might think are happy life changes, like, the birth of a baby or getting married or graduating from college, like things that you might think are, well, those are happy. Yeah, they're happy, but they're still stressful. They're changes. Change is always stressful. So these are actually a little bit more problematic than catastrophic events because with significant life changes, especially the ones that are supposed to be positive, you don't get all those people who come in and try and help you through it. You're supposed to be happy, right? What do you need help with? And so a lot of times you're left to sort of get through these changes on your own, or you have to really ask for somebody's support or help or advice or whatever. It can be a more stressful experience, right? Like it can have a more harmful effect in the long run. When we look at the ages of people who experience high stress, emerging adulthood is by and way more stressful period of time than any other period of the adult lifespan. And one of the reasons why that is true is because there's so much change going on in an 18 to 25-year-old's life, right? Like there's so much moving out of your parents' home or finding your first, job, going off to college. I mean, like there's so much opportunity for so many things to be different. And so it's very stressful. As we get older, there luckily are fewer and fewer of these just giant life changes that can be so stressful. So many of them happen at the same time in young adulthood. You may get one or two in a year as an adult. But really what I want to talk about the most is daily hassles as stressors. Daily hassles, having to wait in line, traffic, deadlines, and maybe even a little sexual harassment from your boss. I don't know what exactly is going on in that picture. But these kinds of daily hassles are not enough of a stressor to really activate your whole fight or flight response, but they're just enough to get a little bit going on. So your heart rate's up, right? Maybe you're secreting a little bit of adrenaline. It's just not enough to really trigger the kind of full, the adaptive syndrome where you go to this peak and you're really fighting or fleeing from the stressor and then you get to recover. It's just enough to make you a little bit stressed. And in a lot of ways, that is more physically harmful to you than if you had to literally fight a bear. In a lot of ways, but probably not in all ways. So let's talk about what stress does to our bodies. One thing that stress does is it elevates our blood pressure, right? That's part of that fight or flight response, is to get your heart rate up, and that elevates your blood pressure. If you're having just sort of this chronic level of slightly elevated blood pressure because you're having these daily hassles that are just kind of always there and always kind of elevating your fight or flight response, you can ultimately end up with coronary heart disease, where this is actually going to be a life-threatening issue over time. Type A personalities, people who are perfectionists, they're really hard driving, really super competitive, and especially those that possess a component called hostility, tend to have higher blood pressure than their peers who are type B personalities, who are a little bit more laid back, a little less competitive, tend to be less critical. So personality that you may just carry with you might make this even worse. Here's a nice little joke to break the tension here. Your problem, Mr. Fitzhugh, is that you're a type A personality in a Model T body. Yeah. So being a type A personality where you're really super hard driving can be really hard on your body in the long run. When we look at explanatory style, some people, when something bad happens, they try and look at the bright side, or they can see this ending and it'll be okay in the long run. That's what we call optimists. Pessimists are people who not only don't do that when something bad happens, but even when good things are happening, they're always waiting for the other shoe to drop kind of thing. They're yeah, it's going fine now, but what's the bad thing that's going to happen? Pessimists are much more likely to develop coronary heart disease than optimists are. So people who have kind of a more negative explanatory style may be dealing with stressors in a different way, in a way that's actually causing their body to experience more of the symptoms. How about stress and illness? I've thought about this a lot over the pandemic, that we've been stressed, we've been worried, we've been concerned. Is it actually making us more vulnerable to, if we were exposed to the virus, to actually develop COVID, right? What researchers have found is that the higher the person is on the psychological stress index, the higher the probability is that they would contract a cold virus that they were exposed to as part of the experiment. Can you imagine signing up for an experiment where you agreed to be exposed to the cold virus? Not all of them caught it. Less than half of them actually caught the cold, even though they were exposed to it. But those who were higher on the psychological stress index were twice as likely to catch the cold as those who were on the lowest on the stress index. So stress actually interferes with our immune system and makes us more vulnerable to catching infections of all different kinds. You may have had that experience with school where you've been pedaling as fast as you can, trying to keep up all the assignments and things that are due, and right at finals week is when you catch a cold or you catch the flu, right? It's oh, now I'm sick and I have to take finals, or I have to write a paper and now I'm sick, right? It's probably because, the stress of everything that you're trying to accomplish has actually, had an impact on the functioning of your immune system. All right. Please forgive my attempt to make an animation out of this infographic. So here we have a person who appears to be upset. let's say that they've been experiencing persistent stressors like bills, or they recently got fired, or a loved one died or something like that. That's going to trigger the release of stress hormones in them. Cortisol, you might have heard of that, is the stress hormone that we tend to secrete when we're experiencing stress. If they're experiencing anger or depression, that also can trigger the release of stress hormones and can also lead to some unhealthy behaviors, right? If you're under stress, if you're feeling angry or depressed, you may take up smoking, or drink too much, or not eat properly, or not sleep enough. And all of those make it more likely that you can catch a cold or get sick in other ways, right? Unhealthy behaviors can lead to the same kinds of things that the release of the stress hormones can. So that's why we have arrows going both ways. But the stress hormones, they're going to elevate your autonomic nervous system. So you may be more prone to headaches, high blood pressure, inflammation in the body. So soreness, these kinds of things can also suppress your immune system, like I was talking about, and can ultimately lead to heart disease. So one of the problems with trying to parse out the effect of stress and the effect of the behaviors that we display under stress is that a lot of times we're doing these very behaviors in an effort to kind of reduce our perception of stress, and those behaviors are just as harmful as like the chronic exposure to stress hormones would be. So that's why there's arrows going both directions, from unhealthy behaviors and from the stress hormones. Cortisol by itself, we think, can ultimately lead to these health-related problems, but the unhealthy behavior certainly can also. All right, this is a good time to take a break, and we will talk about, well, what can we do since we're all under stress? How do we cope? So let's talk about that in the next segment.